A grizzly bear, covered in millions of barnacles and parasites, struggled to survive in the wild. Her body, once majestic, was now a harrowing symbol of pain and suffering. No one believed she could make it, but when a team of rescuers risked everything to save her, the outcome shocked everyone. This is a story about hope, courage, and the unbreakable will to survive. Prepare to be moved to tears as we follow this grizzly's incredible journey. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this one to life. The rugged wilderness of Alaska's Kodiak Island was breathtaking, a landscape of towering evergreens, snow-dusted mountains, and rivers glinting under the weak winter sun. But for wildlife biologist Sarah Milan, the beauty was dimmed by an urgent call that had come through her satellite radio just hours ago. A fisherman had spotted a grizzly in distress, a bear unlike anything he'd ever seen. "She's covered in barnacles," the man's voice crackled through the radio. "She's weak, barely moving." Barnacles? Sarah had been working with grizzlies for over a decade, tracking and protecting these iconic creatures. Never in her life had she heard of anything like this. Accompanied by her field assistant, Nate, Sarah quickly packed supplies into their ATV, tranquilizers, medical kits, and a drone for aerial scouting. When they arrived at the location near the rocky shoreline, the sight that greeted them was nothing short of devastating. The grizzly stood waist-deep in a tide pool, her massive body weighed down by clusters of parasites and barnacles clinging to her fur. Her once powerful frame was gone. Her movements were sluggish. Each step seemed to take an eternity, as though she were dragging the weight of the ocean itself. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Oh my God," she whispered. "She's starving." Nate adjusted the drone controller, sending it up to capture a better view. The images confirmed their fears. The barnacles weren't limited to her legs, they clung to her torso, her back, even her face, forming grotesque clumps that looked more like coral than fur. Mixed among them were leeches and other parasites, feeding off her deteriorating body. "She must have been trapped underwater for a long time," Sarah murmured. "Maybe in fishing nets or some kind of debris." Nate shook his head. "How is she even alive?" The question hung in the icy air. Sarah knew they couldn't leave her like this, but attempting a rescue would be dangerous. Grizzlies, especially ones in distress, were unpredictable. And this bear, despite her weakened state, still had the power to kill with a single swipe. "We need to call for backup," Sarah decided. "This is bigger than the two of us." Hours later, a small team of wildlife rescuers arrived, including veterinarian Dr. Elena Cruz. Armed with tranquilizers and specialized gear, they formulated a plan. They would sedate the bear, clean her wounds, and assess the extent of the damage. It was a race against time. The bear's condition was deteriorating, and every moment spent in the cold tide pool sapped her remaining strength. As the team prepared to approach, Sarah couldn't shake the look in the bear's eyes. Beneath the layers of suffering, there was something profoundly haunting, an unspoken plea for help. For the first time in her career, Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. She whispered under her breath, "We're going to save you. I promise." The first tranquilizer dart hit its mark, sinking into the bear's thick shoulder. The grizzly let out a low, guttural growl but didn't run. The second dart followed, and within minutes, her massive body collapsed into the shallow water. The team rushed forward, working with a mix of urgency and caution. "Careful," Dr. Cruz warned. "Her skin is covered in lesions. We don't know how deep the infections go." Using gloves and sterilized tools, the team began removing the barnacles one by one. Each pull revealed raw, bleeding flesh underneath. Sarah's stomach churned as she worked. How long had the bear endured this? Weeks? Months? The thought was unbearable. As night fell, they set up a makeshift shelter on the beach to monitor the bear's condition. Exhausted but determined, Sarah sat by the fire, replaying the day's events in her mind. She couldn't shake the feeling that saving this bear was more than just a job. It was a mission, a test of everything she believed in. The bear, now freed from some of her burden, lay motionless under a thermal blanket. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Sarah whispered again, "You're going to make it. We're not giving up on you." The sun crept over the horizon, casting a dim light on the makeshift camp along the beach. The gentle crash of waves was the only sound, but Sarah could feel the tension in the air. The bear lay still under the thermal blankets, her massive chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. After hours spent removing barnacles and parasites the previous evening, the team knew their work was far from over. Dr. Elena Cruz knelt by the bear, carefully inspecting the exposed wounds left behind by the removal of the barnacles. "These infections are bad," she said, her voice heavy with concern. "If we don't act fast, sepsis could set in. Her immune system is already compromised." Sarah's hands clenched into fists. She had seen grizzlies in tough situations before, but nothing like this. This bear had been through something unimaginable, trapped and suffering for weeks, maybe longer. The fact that she had survived this long spoke volumes about her resilience. But it also underscored the fragile line she was walking between life and death. "What do we need to do?" Sarah asked, her voice steadier than she felt. Dr. Cruz sighed. "We need to clean and dress every wound, administer antibiotics, and keep her hydrated. But even if we do all of that, there's no guarantee she'll make it." "She'll make it," Sarah said firmly. Her eyes never left the bear. She had to. The team set to work, each person taking on a specific task. Nate prepared the 4 fluids, carefully inserting the needle into a vein in the bear's foreleg. Dr. Cruz mixed a potent cocktail of antibiotics, painkillers, and vitamins, while Sarah cleaned the wounds with a steady hand. The barnacles had left deep craters in the bear's skin, some oozing with pus, others scabbed over with thick, crusty layers. Every touch made Sarah wince. She could only imagine the pain the bear must have endured. "Why would she be covered in barnacles?" Nate asked, breaking the heavy silence. Dr. Cruz glanced up from her work. She was probably trapped underwater for an extended period, fishing nets, debris, maybe even an old shipwreck. Barnacles only attach to a surface when it's stationary long enough for them to settle and grow. But how did she get free? Sarah wondered aloud. No one had an answer. The idea of the bear thrashing and fighting her way to freedom was both heartbreaking and inspiring. Whatever had happened, it was clear that this grizzly's will to survive was extraordinary. Hours passed as the team worked tirelessly. By the time they finished, the sun was high in the sky, casting its warmth over the beach. The bear's wounds were cleaned and dressed, her body hydrated, and her breathing steadier, but the battle was far from over. "We need to move her," Sarah said. "She can't stay out here. If she wakes up and tries to walk in this condition, she'll tear open her wounds." The team had already discussed the next steps. There was a wildlife rehabilitation center a few hours away by boat, equipped to handle cases like this. Transporting a 600-pound grizzly bear, however, was no small feat. Nate scratched his head. We can sedate her for the trip, but if she wakes up on the boat... He let the thought trail off. We'll have to take that risk, Sarah said. She'll have a better chance there than she does out here. With careful coordination, the team loaded the bear onto a sturdy stretcher. Every movement had to be precise to avoid aggravating her injuries. It took all of them to lift her into the back of a transport vehicle designed for large wildlife. As they secured her, Sarah's mind raced with questions. Would she survive the trip? Would the rehab center be able to help her? And perhaps most pressing, what had brought her to this point in the first place? The boat ride to the rehabilitation center was tense. The bear remained sedated, her massive body strapped securely to the deck. Sarah stayed by her side, monitoring her breathing and checking her 4 fluids. The rhythmic hum of the boat's engine did little to calm her nerves. She's strong, Nate said, breaking the silence. Stronger than I've ever seen to survive what she's been through. Sarah nodded. Yeah. She's a fighter. But even fighters had limits. The bear's body was ravaged, her strength depleted. Sarah couldn't shake the image of her standing in the tide pool, barnacles clinging to her like chains. It was a sight she would never forget, a symbol of both suffering and survival. As the boat approached the dock, the rehab team was waiting, ready to take over. Sarah felt a pang of apprehension as they transferred the bear to a new stretcher. She had been with this Grizzly through the worst of it, and now she had to trust others to continue the fight. You're in good hands, she whispered as they wheeled the bear away. But the words felt hollow. What if it wasn't enough? What if they were too late? Standing on the dock, watching the bear disappear into the rehab center, Sarah felt the weight of the past 48 hours settle on her shoulders. She had done everything she could. Now, it was up to the bear, and perhaps a little luck. The air inside the rehabilitation center was thick with anticipation as the grizzly bear was carefully wheeled into the medical bay. The fluorescent lights illuminated her battered body, every wound telling a story of survival and pain. Sarah stood just outside the room, watching through a large glass window as the center's veterinarians worked quickly, their movements precise and deliberate. Dr. Cruz, now working alongside the rehab team, updated Sarah on the situation. We've stabilized her for now, but her condition is still critical. She's severely underweight, and those infections. It's going to take everything we've got to pull her through. Sarah nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Do you think she knows we're trying to help? She asked quietly. Dr. Cruz paused, her expression softening. Animals like her, they know more than we give them credit for. She wouldn't have let us get this far if she didn't sense something. It was a small comfort, but Sarah clung to it. Watching the veterinarians clean and redress the grizzly's wounds, she felt a pang of guilt. Every parasite, every barnacle, every infected lesion had been a reminder of how long this bear had suffered without help. And now, even with a team of experts and all the right tools, there were no guarantees. The first 24 hours at the rehabilitation center were critical. Sarah and Nate stayed close, offering their assistance wherever they could. Most of their time was spent observing and recording the bear's condition, each flicker of her eyelids, each shallow breath was noted and analyzed. It was exhausting work, but no one was willing to let their guard down. She's responding to the antibiotics, one of the veterinarians announced late that evening. The inflammation is starting to go down, and her vitals are holding steady. It was the first bit of good news they had received, and it lifted the spirits of the entire team. Sarah allowed herself a rare smile, though it was tinged with caution. She had seen recoveries take sudden turns before, and she knew better than to celebrate too soon. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the medical bay to find Dr. Cruz examining a series of X-rays. The images revealed a troubling picture, fragments of metal embedded in the bear's shoulder. "Inside bullets?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Cruz nodded grimly. "At least 3, likely from a hunting attempt that didn't go as planned. They're old wounds, but they've never healed properly. That's part of why she's in such bad shape." Sarah felt her chest tighten with anger. Poachers. Hunters. She had seen their work before, but it never got easier. The thought of someone shooting at this bear, leaving her to suffer and fend for herself, was almost too much to bear. "Can you remove them?" she asked. Dr. Cruz hesitated. "It's risky. Surgery would put a tremendous strain on her body, and in her current state, there's no guarantee she'd survive. For now, we'll focus on stabilizing her further. If she gains strength, we can reassess." It was a bitter pill to swallow, but Sarah understood. The bear's fight wasn't just against her current injuries, it was against a lifetime of trauma and neglect. Still, the discovery of the bullets added another layer to her story, one that filled Sarah with both sorrow and determination. Days turned into a week, and slowly, the Grizzly began to show signs of improvement. Her appetite returned, and she started to move her limbs, albeit weakly. The team monitored her around the clock, celebrating each small victory while bracing for setbacks. One evening, as Sarah sat by the observation window, she saw something that made her heart leap. The bear's eyes opened, wide and alert. For the first time, they locked onto Sarah's. It was a brief moment, but it felt monumental. Those eyes, once clouded with pain, now held a glimmer of something else, recognition, maybe even trust. "She's going to make it," Nate said softly, standing beside her. Sarah turned to him, her expression resolute. "Not just make it, she's going to thrive." But even as she spoke the words, she knew the road ahead would be long and uncertain. The bear's story was far from over, and neither was their fight to save her. The quiet hum of the rehabilitation center was interrupted by the low groan of the grizzly bear, as she shifted on her bedding for the first time. The team paused in their work, every pair of eyes darting toward the medical bay. Sarah's heart leapt at the sound, but she knew better than to assume this was a turning point. The bear's recovery was as fragile as glass, even the smallest complication could send everything spiraling out of control. Dr. Elena Cruz stood by the bear's side, adjusting the 4 fluids. "She's becoming more responsive," she said, her tone cautious but hopeful. "But her energy reserves are still dangerously low. We're walking a tightrope here." Sarah nodded, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. The bear had endured so much: starvation, infection, old bullet wounds, but surviving wasn't the same as thriving. The next few days would determine whether she could truly begin to heal. That afternoon, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain lashed against the windows of the rehabilitation center, and the power flickered intermittently. The team worked by generator light, their nerves frayed by the mounting tension. The bear seemed restless, her breathing erratic as the storm intensified outside. "She can sense it," Nate said, glancing at the monitors. "Animals always do." Sarah didn't reply. Instead, she focused on the bear's eyes, which fluttered open for brief moments before closing again. She wondered what the bear was feeling: fear, confusion, maybe even resignation. The thought made her chest ache. But the storm wasn't the only problem. By evening, the bear's condition took a sudden turn. Her temperature spiked, and her breathing grew labored. Dr. Cruz quickly assessed the situation and delivered grim news. "She's developing sepsis," she said, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to act now, or we're going to lose her." The team sprang into action. Antibiotics were adjusted, fluids increased, and every available tool was employed to stabilize the bear. Sarah worked alongside Dr. Cruz, her hands steady even as her mind raced with fear. She had fought for this bear from the moment she first saw her, and the thought of losing her now was unbearable. Hours stretched into the night, the storm outside a constant reminder of the chaos within. At one point, Sarah stepped outside to catch her breath, the rain soaking her to the bone. She leaned against the building, her hands trembling as she fought back tears. "She's a fighter," Nate said, stepping outside to join her. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed his worry. "If anyone can make it through this, it's her." Sarah nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. I can't shake the feeling that we're running out of time." Nate placed a hand on her shoulder. "Then we make every second count." Back inside, the team faced an agonizing wait. The antibiotics began to take effect, but it was a slow process. Every hour felt like an eternity as they monitored the bear's vitals, watching for any sign of improvement. And then, just before dawn, a miracle happened. The bear's breathing began to steady, her fever breaking as the first light of morning filtered through the windows. The team let out a collective sigh of relief, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten. "She's not out of the woods yet," Dr. Cruz cautioned. "But this is a good sign." Sarah leaned against the wall, her legs threatening to give out from sheer relief. She watched as the bear shifted slightly, her massive body finally at rest. For the first time in days, Sarah allowed herself to hope. The storm passed, leaving the world outside drenched but calm. Inside the rehabilitation center, the atmosphere was one of cautious optimism. The bear's fight was far from over, but she had made it through the night, a testament to her resilience and the team's unwavering dedication. As Sarah sat by the observation window, watching the bear sleep peacefully, she thought about everything that had led them to this moment: the fisherman's call, the harrowing rescue, the grueling hours of care. It all felt like a lifetime ago. But the journey was far from over. "We're not done yet," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. But in her heart, she knew they had taken the first real step toward giving this bear a second chance at life. The sun rose over the rehabilitation center, casting golden light through the tall pines that surrounded it. Inside, the atmosphere was quieter now, though tension still hung in the air like a faint shadow. The grizzly bear rested on her bedding, her breathing steady but shallow. For the first time since her arrival, she seemed calm. Yet for Sarah, the stillness felt heavy, a reminder that they weren't out of danger just yet. Dr. Elena Cruz and her team were reviewing the bear's X-rays again, particularly the fragments of bullets lodged in her shoulder. The injuries were old, likely from a hunting attempt years ago, but they had never healed properly. Now, they were a ticking time bomb that could jeopardize her fragile recovery. "We bought her time," Dr. Cruz said, her voice measured. "But if we don't remove those fragments soon, they'll continue to cause inflammation and infections. It's a delicate balance. She needs to gain strength before we can even think about surgery." Sarah nodded, her arms crossed as she stared at the X-rays. "And if she doesn't?" she asked softly. Dr. Cruz met her gaze. "Then she won't survive another infection. Her body won't be able to fight it." The weight of those words settled on Sarah like a stone. Every step forward felt like walking a tightrope, one wrong move threatening to undo everything they'd worked for. She thought back to the first time she saw the bear, standing in the tide pool, her body covered in barnacles and parasites. This bear had fought to survive against impossible odds. Sarah refused to let her story end here. Over the next few days, the bear's condition began to stabilize further. She started to eat more, her appetite returning in small but encouraging increments. The team introduced a diet rich in nutrients to help her rebuild her strength. Each meal felt like a victory, a testament to the bear's resilience. But as her physical health improved, questions about her past began to surface. Sarah couldn't stop wondering how this bear had ended up in such a dire state. The barnacles and parasites suggested she'd been trapped underwater for a prolonged period, but the bullet wounds told another story entirely. Nate, ever curious, began digging through local reports of wildlife incidents. One evening, he approached Sarah with a file in hand. "You need to see this," he said, his voice tinged with urgency. Sarah took the file and scanned its contents. It detailed a poaching operation that had been dismantled years ago near the coastline where they had found the bear. Several animals had been shot and left for dead, their bodies never recovered. The dates matched the estimated age of the bear's bullet wounds. "She's one of them," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. "She survived that?" Nate nodded. "It explains a lot. She must have escaped, but she's been carrying the weight of those injuries ever since." The realization hit Sarah like a wave. This bear had been fighting for her life long before they had found her. Every scar, every wound, told a story of survival against the odds. It wasn't just her body they were healing, it was years of trauma, a lifetime of pain. That night, Sarah sat by the bear's enclosure, watching her sleep. The moonlight filtered through the window, casting a soft glow over the room. The bear's chest rose and fell in a steady rhythm, a small but significant sign of progress. "You're stronger than anyone I've ever met," Sarah whispered. "We're going to get you through this. I promise." Her words hung in the air, a quiet vow that she intended to keep. But deep down, she knew the road ahead would be fraught with challenges. The surgery to remove the bullet fragments was a looming hurdle, one that could make or break the bear's recovery. And even if they succeeded, there was no guarantee that the bear could ever return to the wild. Her injuries and prolonged suffering had left lasting scars, both physical and emotional. The next morning, the team gathered to discuss the plan moving forward. Dr. Cruz outlined the risks of the surgery, her tone serious but hopeful. "If we wait too long, the inflammation could spread. But if we move too soon, she might not survive the anesthesia. We're walking a fine line here." "What's the alternative?" Sarah asked. Dr. Cruz hesitated. "There isn't one. This surgery is her best chance." Silence filled the room as the weight of the decision settled over them. Sarah looked around at the faces of her team, each one reflecting the same mix of fear and determination. They had come too far to give up now. "Then we do it," Sarah said firmly. "We owe it to her to try." Dr. Cruz nodded, and the team got to work preparing for the procedure. As they moved with purpose, Sarah felt a renewed sense of determination. This bear had survived so much, endured so much, she deserved every chance they could give her. As the hours ticked by, the grizzly bear lay in her enclosure, unaware of the storm brewing around her. The team worked tirelessly, their collective hope fueling every decision, every action. The weight of the past loomed large, but so did the promise of a future, one where this bear could finally find peace. The morning of the surgery was thick with tension. The once quiet halls of the rehabilitation center buzzed with controlled chaos, as the team prepared for what could be the most critical moment in the grizzly bear's recovery. Equipment was triple-checked, anesthesia calculated to the last decimal, and every member of the team was briefed on their role. Failure wasn't an option, but the risks weighed heavily on everyone's mind. Sarah stood just outside the medical bay, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She watched through the observation window as Dr. Cruz and the surgical team methodically prepared the bear for the procedure. The grizzly lay sedated, her massive frame stretched out on the surgical table, monitors hooked to her chest to track her fragile vitals. "We're ready to begin," Dr. Cruz said over the intercom, her voice steady but with an edge of tension. Sarah gave a small nod, though she knew they couldn't see her. The first incision was made carefully, a delicate line along the bear's shoulder to access the embedded bullet fragments. Sarah winced despite herself, her mind racing with questions. What if they'd moved too soon? What if her body couldn't handle the stress? She shook the thoughts away, forcing herself to focus on the bear's rhythmic breathing, visible on the monitor. It was steady for now. The surgery stretched into hours. Each fragment was painstakingly removed, the team working with surgical precision to avoid causing further damage. Dr. Cruz's brow furrowed in concentration as she extracted the largest piece, a jagged shard of metal lodged dangerously close to the bear's lung. "Got it," she murmured, holding the fragment up briefly before dropping it into a sterile tray. A collective sigh of relief swept through the room, but the battle was far from over. The team quickly moved to close the wounds and ensure there were no signs of internal bleeding. Sarah paced outside the observation room, her nails digging into her palms. Every minute felt like an eternity. Nate appeared beside her, holding 2 steaming cups of coffee. "Figured you could use this," he said, handing her one. His attempt at a reassuring smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Thanks," Sarah said, though she didn't touch the cup. Her focus remained locked on the operating table. "Do you think she knows what we're doing for her?" Nate shrugged. "I think she knows she's not alone. And sometimes, that's enough." Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, Dr. Cruz emerged from the medical bay. Her scrubs were stained, her face lined with exhaustion, but there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. "She made it through the surgery," she said. "Everything went as well as we could have hoped. Now, it's up to her." Sarah felt a wave of relief crash over her, her knees nearly giving out as she leaned against the wall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Dr. Cruz placed a hand on her shoulder. "She's a fighter. You gave her a chance. That's more than most would have done." The bear was moved back to her enclosure, her body still heavily sedated. The team monitored her around the clock, watching for any signs of complications. Sarah hardly left her side, sleeping in a makeshift cot just outside the enclosure. She woke to every small movement, every change in the monitors, her heart leaping with both hope and fear. The first 48 hours were critical, and the team knew it. They worked in shifts, ensuring the bear's pain was managed and her vitals remained stable. Dr. Cruz checked in frequently, her quiet confidence a steadying presence in the midst of uncertainty. 2 days after the surgery, the bear opened her eyes. It was a small, hesitant movement, but it felt monumental. Sarah was sitting by the enclosure, her notebook open but untouched in her lap when she saw the bear's gaze meet hers. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. "Hey there," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're okay. You're safe." The bear didn't move, but her eyes remained locked on Sarah's. There was something in her expression, a flicker of recognition, a quiet understanding. It was enough to bring tears to Sarah's eyes. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope that the bear might truly recover, not just physically, but emotionally as well. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism. The bear's strength began to return, her movements more deliberate, her appetite growing steadily. The team watched in awe as she took her first tentative steps around the enclosure, her massive frame no longer weighed down by pain and infection. Sarah documented every moment, her notebook filling with details of the bear's progress. But more than that, she found herself reflecting on what this bear had taught her. Resilience wasn't just about survival. It was about finding the strength to heal, even when the odds were stacked against you. "She's going to make it," Nate said one evening, watching as the bear settled into her bedding, her eyes closing in peaceful sleep. Sarah nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Yeah. She is." The morning air was crisp and filled with the distant sound of chirping birds as Sarah stood at the edge of the enclosure. It had been weeks since the surgery, and the grizzly bear had come further than anyone dared to hope. Her once gaunt and ravaged body was now a testament to resilience, her fur beginning to shine under the sun, her movements steady and purposeful. The team had worked tirelessly to bring her to this point. The infections had cleared, the wounds had healed, and the bear's strength had returned. Now, only one question remained. Could she return to the wild? Dr. Cruz joined Sarah, her hands in her coat pockets. "She's ready," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "The tests show her mobility is back to normal, and she's behaving like a true grizzly. She's ready to be free." Sarah nodded, her emotions swirling. This was the moment they had worked so hard for, but letting go wasn't easy. She'd grown attached to the bear in a way she hadn't anticipated. Watching her fight, heal, and now thrive had been nothing short of transformative. "We've chosen a release site," Dr. Cruz continued. "It's remote, with plenty of food and minimal human activity. She'll have the best chance there." The day of the release arrived quickly. The team loaded the bear into a specially designed transport cage, taking every precaution to ensure her comfort and safety. Sarah rode in the back of the truck, her hand resting on the outside of the cage. The bear was calm, her dark eyes occasionally meeting Sarah's through the slats. The drive to the release site was long, winding through dense forests and rugged terrain. As the truck climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was what they'd been working toward, but the unknowns of the wild weighed heavily on her mind. When they arrived at the site, the team worked quickly to set up. The cage was positioned at the edge of a clearing, surrounded by towering trees and underbrush teeming with life. The scent of pine and fresh earth filled the air as the team made their final checks. Sarah stood by the cage, her hand gripping the release lever. She looked at the bear, who seemed to sense that something was about to change. Their eyes met one last time, and Sarah felt a lump rise in her throat. "You've got this," she whispered. "This is your world. Go live it." With a deep breath, Sarah pulled the lever. The cage door swung open, and for a moment, the bear remained still. Then, with a deliberate step, she emerged, her massive frame moving with grace and purpose. She paused at the edge of the clearing, her nose lifted to the wind, taking in the sense of the wild. And then she was gone. With a powerful stride, the grizzly disappeared into the forest, her golden-brown coat blending seamlessly with the trees. The team stood in silence, watching until she was no longer visible. The drive back to the rehabilitation center was quiet. Sarah stared out the window, replaying the release in her mind. She felt a profound mix of loss and fulfillment, knowing that they had given the bear a second chance but also realizing she might never see her again. When they arrived, Sarah sat alone in the observation room, her notebook open in front of her. She began to write, documenting every detail of the bear's journey, from the tide pool to the forest. But her words weren't just for the record. They were for herself, a way to process everything she'd learned. Resilience, courage, healing. These were the lessons the grizzly had taught her. The bear's journey had mirrored so many human struggles, and Sarah couldn't help but feel changed by the experience. Nate found her hours later, her notebook now full of scribbled notes and reflections. He placed a hand on her shoulder and smiled. "She'll be okay," he said. "And so will you." Sarah nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yeah, we will." If this story touched your heart, remember, resilience and compassion can overcome even the greatest challenges. The grizzly bear's journey is a reminder that no matter how broken we feel, there is always hope for healing and a brighter future. Subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Leave a like, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of the strength within us all, and let's spread a message of courage and hope together.